so there's kind of two levels to the administration side of this. So one is pretty similar to the kind of view that your users typically get, and the reason for that is that it is actually the same view that your users typically get, with the exception that an administrator on the system has more permissions than a regular user, right? So all of the things that you're kind of used to seeing here, right? So down here, there's report sections. All of that stuff is there. There's just some additional capabilities. So mostly to be able to create new things. There's some additional, fields that your users typically don't get to see. So in, degree types is maybe something they don't get to see normally, right? So, but really what we're looking at here is a view into the database, right? So this is kind of a web presentation of the database, right? And so in each of these cases, we can kind of, just jump into any of these and go create, delete, and modify any of the data in the database. So this is one level, and the reason that this looks like the web UI is that the web user interface is that originally, again, if we kind of go back to the start of this process, it was Microsoft Access for a while, and then it changed to Django, and kind of when it changed from Django, so Django is the platform that we use today. When it changed from the guy that kind of originally built this, a much different version of this platform, but kind of the version of the platform that was there when I took over, there was a clear indication that having learned the Microsoft Access user interface, and then learned the Django admin user interface, that no matter what we did going forward, that we should preserve the user interface so that there wasn't a third kind of learning process for yet another new user interface, right? So typically when we build these Django-based sites today, and if you go kind of look at how these sites are built, then the admin side of it is very much kind of the management side, and typically then you present in a kind of a custom-built UI. You present whatever data you want to present to the users, right? And so we've got today a bunch of examples of those kinds of platforms. In the case of AHEC, we use the admin site as the primary user interface because that was kind of what we had at the time, and we didn't want to go through this cycle of relearning the user interface. So there's some non-typical things that we do as a result. So, for example, when we have, let's see, what's a good example? The person page is probably a reasonable example of that. So on the person page here, if we jump into a given person, there are a bunch of, I think at the bottom of this, there's this kind of advanced as students thing, and then other student details, and particularly this HCPP advanced as students, and then the long-term tracking stuff, right? Are things that we've kind of shoehorned into, and shoehorned isn't quite right, but we've augmented the user interface that Django gives us for the admin side to include those things in the admin side, right? So if you're looking at Django development, then this might not be a typical approach to doing this, but it fit the model that we had at that point. And again, these kinds of these fields here where we have the question marks to be able to get field-specific help. Again, that's something that we've kind of built into the Django admin as a result of kind of having to, work with the interface that we had. So this is maybe the easiest way, though, for if you want to be able to start making modifications to the site. This is maybe the easiest way in which to do it, right? to some extent, there is some control here. To some extent, you will be, if you delete things, you will get kind of confirmations before you delete things. It'll still let you delete things that are kind of fundamental to the database. So if you're in this mode, for example, and you decide to delete a center, the result of that, if you kind of have a feel for how databases work, right? The result of deleting that center can typically cascade into deleting a bunch of other records in unassociated fields. And the admin site will warn you that you're about to do that, but it will certainly let you do that, right? So operating in this mode, kind of in the configuration that we're in today, you know, as a user, as a super user on the system, for example, you can certainly do things that are catastrophic to the data that's on there, right? So, however, you can essentially make any changes you want, right? So if you wanted, for example, to rename a center, you could rename a center using this user interface. You could add a new center using this interface. Those kinds of things, right? So at kind of the first level, this interface allows you to modify data on a system in essentially an arbitrary fashion, right? So whatever you want it to do. The next kind of level down from there then is if you want to kind of augment functionality or modify functionality that exists, right? So to either do something new or to change the workflow for something that exists, then that ends up kind of getting into the level of code, and that is also possible, right? So Django is a Python-based platform. I don't know off the top of my head how many lines of Python we have in here, but it'll be, you know, in the few tens of thousands, right? Maybe 10,000 to, you know, 30,000 kind of range. And basically the sequence of events is you have data in the database, you have a Python function that is invoked by, you know, essentially somebody entering a URL. The Python function gets data from the database, so it performs a set of queries. Those queries are then kind of returned, evaluated, manipulated, whatever you want to do, and then that data is kind of returned to the user typically through a template. So you essentially build a response page as the combination of a template, which is you can roughly think of as HTML with some ability to process data in it, and the specific data based on the request that the user made, right? So if you're comfortable with writing code in Python, then you can kind of modify and manipulate the queries that are made to the database. You can modify the data as it's returned so that maybe you only show certain fields from the database or whatever it happens to be to specific users. You then kind of send that to a template, and again, the template is basically what the page layout looks like after the fact. So again, if we have if we look at this person page here, then at the end of that, there's a chunk of code that for example, has this long-term tracking section. For example, at the end, there's a piece of that template that says, okay, so for this person, show me all of the long-term tracking records that we have for that person, and then kind of lay them out in this format, right? So that's the general approach there. Again, if you are if you're kind of working at that level, then you really have the ability to add any additional arbitrary functionality that you want. And the flip side of that is you have the ability to break any functionality that you want as well, right? So, you know, you can certainly operate at that level as well. This site has been interesting in that so the world would be perfect, right? If you started a project and you sat down and you said, like, here's the requirements, and kind of you build a system based on the requirements, right? Which would be a lovely way for the world to work, right? And it's almost never the case. So for a variety of reasons, right, AHEC has, or this AHEC platform, Pipeline Cache, right, has evolved quite dramatically over the years, right? There's been functionality that, for example, funding agencies have dictated that they want to be able to start collecting data or producing reports or changing the way that reports actually are produced or presented. And sometimes they will kind of, and so those drive the changes in this system, right? So the system that we have today is certainly not one that we would have built with the requirements that we have today. But we're not starting today, right? So and realistically, the requirements are going to change tomorrow and the next day. Every few months, as maybe HRSA, for example, decides that they want to modify the reporting requirements or whatever it happens to be, right? So it is very much an evolution in terms of the code, and even in some cases we've kind of added functionality, and then it's been used for a couple of cycles, and then we've removed it, and then we've kind of added it back in again, or it still kind of exists because it was never clear if the funding agencies were going to kind of change their mind and come back and say, no, we really actually do want you to collect, the name of the user's first dog or whatever it happens to be, right? So yeah, there's been quite an evolution as we've kind of worked through this, but if you want to be able to kind of evolve the system as it works today, then the Python level is kind of where you need to be, right? So yeah, so I don't know if this is helpful or what you were hoping for, or in line with the overview that you were trying to get. It is so if you're kind of comfortable with web development using this specific framework, actually using this Django framework, then there's a reasonable amount of kind of just orienting yourself to the to kind of the way things work. But then once you kind of get your head around that, then I think it's feasible to be able to do this. If you're looking at this from a kind of first project in Django, and that may be the case, right? So I don't know for sure. This is a complicated first project in Django because it really hasn't been because of the evolutionary nature, right? It's quite big to start with, and because of the evolution that it's gone through. Again, design choices that would be obvious today with today's requirements are probably, or may not actually be, the way we've implemented things because they weren't in line with the requirements that we had either when we started building this or, kind of at some point in that evolution. So, it would be, I think, an interesting first jump into Django development if you haven't seen any of that before. But it's not impossible, right? It's data and code and presentation. So it will just take some time to kind of spin up and particularly to go make major changes. There are a bunch of minor changes that you could make relatively easily, right? So for example, on this view here, if we wanted a different filter on the left here, we didn't want the precept filter to be shown, we wanted something else there. To be able to add that in would be relatively reasonable. To go make more fundamental changes, I think would take a while longer.
Brian, yeah. I can interject. So first off, thank you. I think this is a good starting point. I want to hear what Amy and Ben might have as questions. But my thought is, in terms of our current contract that we have with you, since we don't have any progress yet, perhaps even using that as a learning opportunity for the complexities of this might be a first project. And Ben, you know more than me about whether or not you're familiar with what he's talking about, but that to me stands out as either way a smart choice to see if we can kind of have Ben sit in with you on making some of these changes, electronically, distance-wise, to see what you do and how you do it and kind of where your brain works through some of those complexities that wouldn't be intuitive based on where we've come and where we are
now. So yeah. So let's do what you suggested. Let's hear if Ben and Amy have questions.
Mm-hmm. So from my perspective, I'm not a database manager, first off. I generally do web design, so I do interact with databases, but usually only in so much as they pertain to supporting the website itself. But for our department, we've actually started, and I'm curious to see, I'd have to talk to her, but if this actual kind of interface structure is what they're using for what we're doing, redesigning our database for our administrative department. I'm not sure that this is quite at the level of what we need for AHEC, at least as far as I'm involved in the project. We may be looking at more of a self-reporting for students. So to take whatever I'm trying to say back to actual question, is this purely for administration to enter in records? Is there any API that allows students to interact with the database at all? Are they self-reporting anything in here?
So,
sorry, that was kind of like stream of consciousness.
No, it's totally fine. So on the Alaska side, the primary users are kind of program administrators, right? So it'd be somebody sitting in an AHEC office who's trying to track their thing. In Utah, they use this in addition to kind of this kind of level of functionality. They also use it as their submission application process for clinical rotation students. So they have a more public-facing version of kind of a more traditional public-facing version of a page that allows students to, or prospective clinical rotation students, to be able to kind of submit an application, right? So it's got that whole kind of, who are you and why do you want to do this? When do you want to do it kind of thing, right? And they submit that application. And then on the back end, there's kind of a workflow for the centers to be able to manage that application process as they kind of figure out, like, is this a viable student for us? Can we match them up with a preceptor? Do we have a location which they can go and actually do this work, right? So that they, and kind of all the way through that process until they either kind of accept or reject an application. And if they accept it, then what it does is it kind of builds the structure in this slide here too, so that clinical rotation objects get created and the student object gets created over here, so that once the kind of program office then takes them on as a as a clinical rotation student, then they have the ability to kind of track them on this kind of back end as well, right? So in some cases, yes, that's true. We don't have any, publicly exposed APIs just now. So, and I'm not actually sure that's, so when you were talking about API, I'm assuming that what you're talking about is an API for a web front end to be able to make calls back into this. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So what framework do you use for that today, right? So if you were developing something and kind of deploying it, what's the framework you use today?
Well, primarily we're just using SQL-based databases, at least for the work that I do. So we could be using a variety of different things. Could just be simple SQL queries. It could be different functions. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. No, I asked that question poorly then. So you have, let's say, an HTML page that allows a student to go write an assessment about what they did, right? Some kind of self-reporting thing that they're going to write, right? So you've got some HTML front end, and you've got a database on the back end. What's the connection between those two things in your world today?
It's just MySQL queries that send authentication to a database, and they get permission to add or delete something from there. For students, if we have students reporting things, we generally, so we're kind of have built a weird system actually on WordPress that generally it's not doing quite what you're doing. Yeah, it's not doing quite what you're doing really at all. It's doing something different where it's adding kind of user profile information as student information that they're keeping. So it's a little bit different, but
no, I think actually WordPress was the answer that I was trying to get to, right? So you have a WordPress-based site, and that's cool. Okay, so for us, right? So that Django is the framework that we're kind of using here, and I think it is relatively easy to expose APIs for things, right? So that if you wanted an API to be able to query for a particular student and show all the blah blah blahs that they've done, right?
Sure.
You can very easily kind of build a REST API, for example, to be able to do that, right? And that REST API can have auth or not, depending on kind of where you're coming from. So that kind of thing is entirely feasible, so that you could kind of use a similar approach, except for your API calls are going into something you define in Django. And once you're in these kinds of framework worlds, though, then it tends to be best to just stay in that world, right? So if you have a WordPress-based site, then I can certainly shoehorn something in from Django to be able to make a call to to an API that you're exposing to me to go get data from kind of your WordPress site. But the reality is it would be actually much better for me to just figure out how to use WordPress, which frankly I don't know at all, right? But it would probably be very easy for you to go spin up a new page in that and say, this is the query that we're going to use for to populate the template that I'm going to write, or whatever it happens to be, right? And realistically, the right answer for me in that mode, if I wanted to be able to add a new page, would be to actually figure out what that process looked like and do it in WordPress, because that's it is the right approach to doing that, unless I have a good compelling reason to do otherwise, is to kind of work within the framework that we have, right? And I think the same thing is true here, right? We could certainly expose APIs and kind of make them accessible to external existing components, and running on a different platform. I think that would be entirely possible. But really, if what you want to do is interact with data that's in the system, then the kind of quote unquote right approach to doing that is to do it within the system, unless there's really a compelling reason to keep those two things separate. Now, the web UI that you're looking at here is kind of it is actually a Django component that has this very kind of databasey records and fields kind of look and feel to it, right? But you can certainly, in the same sense that you can kind of build an arbitrary page and populate it in WordPress with data that you've pulled from the database. The same is true in Django, right? You can build kind of an arbitrary HTML template. It has kind of inline processing so that you can kind of loop through things, and for all the records that you got, then build this block of data and yada yada yada, right? All of those kinds of things are possible, right? So I think anything that you can kind of envision doing in WordPress, you can also do in Django, right? All the way from the kind of SQL backend, right? And we're using a SQL backend as well here, right? It's Postgres specific. So Django is really the Python-y piece that gives you a nice interface into that, a nice programming interface into that. So anything you could kind of envision doing in WordPress, you could do in Django. It's just not going to be the same kind of approach. Like the code isn't going to be the same, and as a result, like you kind of have to make a decision about whether this is going to be a one-off thing, in which case maybe exposing a single API to be able to give you data and let you work in a, you know, an environment that you're comfortable with, is the right approach. And in that case, if it really was kind of a one-off thing, then I think that is the right approach. Or if it's not, right, if it's, we want to be able to kind of jump into this thing with both feet and really kind of start to build user interfaces on top of it that allow our students to interact with it in a less kind of, you know, blocky row and field kind of way, right? Then,
Sure.
then you know, you've got that kind of learning curve, I guess, of kind of learning how to do the things you already know how to do in WordPress in Django. But then once you learn that, then kind of you'll be able to kind of roll from there, right? So the second through the end thing are going to be much, much easier, but that first thing is going to be painful, or at least much harder than it would be to just do it in, you know, in a system you're familiar with. And that, you know, the same would be true for me. And you know, if you said, come and, you know, write this page for us in WordPress, right, it would be awful, right? It would be, it would just be a whole new environment that I would have to figure out and kind of get my head around. But then once I did that, right, the second through the end thing would be much easier because I would be doing things natively in the environment as opposed to kind of trying to shoehorn them into the, you know, shoehorn the way that my brain works from doing this into an environment that's maybe not well suited for.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And our program actually doesn't have, we don't have a complete kind of website interface built yet, so it's still open-ended where we want to go. In my experience, I've mostly worked with WordPress, so I was just kind of, you know, and I thank you for helping me kind of think through out loud what that would entail in maybe WordPress versus Django, what the differences kind of would end up being. And a lot of it really is just like you say, it's like, what platform do you want to do? Pick that and then bring them together. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is, like, what platform can you support, right? Like that, I mean, that's the other key too, right? Is that, you know, part of what we're talking about here today is is how much time I have to kind of be able to commit to supporting this platform, which isn't a great place for, you know, for everybody to be right now, but it is where we are, right?
Sure.
So yeah, I think I think one thing that I would say is, regardless of what direction you go in, and you may know this already, right? But this will be, you will get this beautiful system built that you are, you know, really, really kind of happy with, and reports all the things you want. And then, at least historically, the funding agencies for these programs have then come in and said, we'd like you to, you know, to be able to go report all of this stuff too. And, you know, we'd like it if you did it for the last year as well, which you didn't collect that data for, but could you kind of go infer it from, you know, whatever, right? So,
sure.
This is more than many web kind of data systems that we've built. This has been a very kind of flexible requirements. The requirements have really evolved, and so as you're building things, I think if you have the opportunity to think about building them either kind of in a static way, or, you know, doing a little bit more work and leaving yourself some elbow room to, you know, to do things more flexibly in the future, I think there's some value in building in the flexibility, because you will likely need it, as, you know, in year kind of 1 through n, right, are going to be, it's going to be a very different system. So anyway, I may be wrong about that, but that has been at least the historical experience has been that the requirements have been flexible.
I encountered a project that didn't eventually decide it needed to go 5 more different directions than we thought. So flexibility is important.
Yeah. Okay, so that was my super long answer to a nice short question. So,
a super long answer to kind of a vague, amorphous question.
Right.
So does anybody have any very specific kinds of questions they want to ask?
So I'm just wondering, Benjamin, how are you feeling about the comfort level with some of the stuff he's talking about in terms of I don't even know, what did he say? Python codes and Django. And
I'm not super experienced with Python and Django. I've worked primarily with like Visual Basic.net and some C#.net. I've been brushing up on the Python and Django recently, and it seems pretty intuitive and straightforward. With your descriptions about this being not necessarily the best place to jump into, it has me a little bit, I think hesitant is the best word, but it seems approachable.
So
get started on some.
So I think if we had a choice of projects for you to jump into, this probably wouldn't be the one, but it is the project we have for you to jump into, right? So like it's which is, you know, partly unfortunate, and you know, you should have asked better questions during the job interview, I guess. No, it's not impossible, right? Like so I think, you know, if you're kind of willing to, you know, bang your head against things, I think there will be easy things that will be kind of approachable to start with, and you know, kind of as you go, I think there's a reasonable opportunity to kind of figure out the more complex things as you go, right? So yeah, I think if you want to go take a look, right? I mean, the easy way into that is to spin up an instance of this for yourself, kind of thing, right? So we use pretty standard technologies, right? It's an Ubuntu 16.04 box, right? So if you're comfortable with doing kind of Ubuntu admin, right? That's or Linux admin in general, right? It's a pretty easy environment, a pretty common environment. Lots of stuff on Stack Overflow about how to do things you don't know how to do, right? So, that's a good upside. And then, you know, you can kind of just the upside about Django specifically is it has some good kind of tutorials, and you know, so first of all, you can kind of just step into Django itself with some, you know, with kind of following along on the basic tutorials, which I think would actually be maybe the best starting point of all, to just go spin up their, you know, their kind of initial tutorials, and it will show you how to do their basic server. They've got a test server there so that you can kind of spin up a project and then an app, and then, you know, create models, and models are really the description of the data, and they really kind of walk you through, you know, how you would do this if you were starting from scratch. And I think if you kind of get your head around those concepts, then it's probably reasonable to go then say, all right, I kind of vaguely understand, or, you know, I've got a kind of basic understanding of this from kind of walking through that tutorial. Let me go see what it would take in the kind of production environment to be able to go change something on that production environment, right? How do I find the model? How do I modify it, right? What's the type of the new field that I want to add, or whatever it happens to be, right? But I think actually that there's, so on the Django site itself, right? There's a 4-part tutorial that kind of very easily from a standalone Linux box walks you through bringing up a basic Django environment in which you can actually kind of add data and look at, you know, a page that pulls that data in a simple web form and things like that. And I think that would be a good starting point to just kind of get a feel for, you know, how reasonable this is, right? If kind of walking through that tutorial takes a year, then, you know, we may be looking in a different direction. But I think that it won't, right? Like I think what you'll get out of that is within, you know, not very much time at all, you'll be able to kind of get a feel for some Django-y concepts, and then that way, when you start to look at some actual, you know, code in the, you know, in the larger scheme of things, right, then you'll at least have a feel for, this is a model, and that's a, you know, that's a template, and here's a context, and here's how those 3 things fit together in order to render a page, right? So I think that's probably a good starting point.
So Amy, did you have any other questions specific to the database?
Yeah, I'm just sorry, I'm just kind of mulling over everything. So just to make sure I have everything straight, these the different centers, they're all integrated, right, into the single database, and that are then separated with different users or however to access them. Is that correct? Or is every center have its own instance, right?
So there's maybe actually 3 levels, right? So we have states. So there are currently 3 states, right? So Alaska, Connecticut, and Utah all have their own specific version of this system, right? So
okay.
To some extent there's lots of similarity between them, but there are state-specific things that they do separately. So the only state, for example, that uses the clinical rotation application is Utah. Some of the states call programs different. So Alaskans into Health Careers, right, which was the name for and may still be. I don't off the top of my head remember, but it wasn't a very Connecticut-friendly name, right? So they have a similar program, but it's a different name, right? So and then within that, each state has regional centers. So each state has its own kind of super user, right? So they are capable of assigning users to centers and a variety of other things. And then at the center level, so a specific AHEC office. They have users that are assigned to that office, and what they can see are the students that are assigned to them, the programs, the specific programs that they're running, the clinical rotations that are in facilities that are associated with their center.
Sure.
So yeah, there is some level of access control, right? And each user of the system has a specific login that gives them the ability to see a portion of the data that is relevant to them, right? And sometimes users actually have a bunch of different logins. So for example, Janice for a long time in Alaska, right, had this kind of super user role where she was able to kind of see all of the data for Alaska from the program office perspective, but she also had a specific login for a specific center so that she could also operate at the level of a center user and kind of see their view of the data, so that when they had a user that called in and said, like, I just added Bob to the database and I can't find them anymore, right? Like Janice could kind of look at their environment in the same way that they did, right? So
sure.
Yeah, so yes, state, centers, and then individual users are our kind of 3 main levels of access.
Okay.
And the other thing, Amy, that I didn't think I shared with you is that we also have federal reports on there as part of our reporting, so that it's aligned with what HRSA is asking us for until they change it again.
Yeah, that's right. Those have been good fun, right? Like, yeah.
So just think about that idea too.
So yeah, we have a bunch of these kinds of. So some of these are kind of not particularly official reports. They're just kind of ways of looking at data, right? So we want to be able to just kind of go get data based on the facilities. But then there are also a set of the and hopefully this is showing up there in a view that you can read, right? But there are a bunch of these kind of federal reports that have changed over the years. But you can kind of do this, so again, this is Alaska, right? So these are the Alaska centers, but we could kind of go run this CE1 report for all of the centers for these particular, dates, right? So, and when I said things have evolved, right? Like this is there's a lot of the evolution that kind of shows up here in terms of these reports, and the result of these is an Excel sheet that kind of is laid out to the best of our ability in the kind of the same format that HRSA in this case is looking for in their reports, right? So there's a lot of evolution in what these reports look like every year and the data that they've collected, and as a result, the kinds of other pieces that we've had to collect, right? So additional information on a particular person, for example, right, as opposed to not collecting their date of birth, right? Now we need to be able to put them into specific age ranges or whatever, right? So we need some way to be able to get that, right? So lots of the evolution year to year kind of has its biggest impact on these reports, but it kind of touches the database throughout.
Okay, great. I know you guys have more to get to your meeting. I don't want to take too much time because you guys have other training. Brian, would you mind if I reached out to you if I have any further questions?
Not at all. You're absolutely welcome to. So just get in touch. Do you have my contact information or?
Yeah, I should. Yeah, I have you as in part of this email chain from Gloria.
Okay, perfect. And I just threw it in the chat there too. So if you need it from there,
great.
That's fine. But yeah, just shoot me an email, and I will do my best to give you reasonable answers to whatever questions you have.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
yep,
Amy.
absolutely.
So let me go back one. So in terms of, you gave us a really good starting point for Benjamin to take a look at some of those training materials and see, how he can feel comfort-wise in playing around in the system a little bit and learning his way through. But the other thing we wanted to talk about with you was our contracts for this year and what your thoughts are, where we are, and how maybe even, like I was saying, how we could possibly use that as an opportunity, a learning opportunity, if possible. I don't know what your time looks like and things like that, but just to talk through some of those pieces, because we did have a meeting. Lauren had a meeting yesterday, was it, or 2 days ago, with Connecticut and Utah to kind of check in on status, just where we are.
Yeah, and so at the end of the day, I'm sure you guys are not particularly happy with progress over the last, and months, right? Which, realistically has been zero, right? I'm not particularly happy with it either. I don't think we're doing any kind of good job on this at this point, right? And I have not invoiced for this work. Because we're essentially not doing it right now, right? And realistically, that's going to be true for April for sure. Do you have the current scope of work just now, or is it easy to jump back to you showing? Do you have that? You have that scope of work up just now, so we're looking at the same thing, or I can go grab it if not.
Just hang on, I can just change myself back.
Yeah.
Let me pull it up.
All right, guys, I will let you get to your rest of your meeting. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, just give me a yell if you got questions.
I sure will. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. We'll do that. Okay, you should be able to do this now. There we go.
So, I mean, kind of going forward, I think we need some level of transition plan, right? Because realistically, we're not supporting this right now particularly well. And so if we're going to continue to be involved, I think, we need to find a way to do that. And if we're not going to continue to be involved, then I think, you need to find we together, but you need a mechanism by which you can kind of support this going forward, right? Because, obviously you guys can't just pack up and go home because I'm not involved in this, right? So, yeah, it's, gosh. The first two of these, right, are, so the first one for sure is actually a pretty reasonable thing that I could walk through with, let's say, Ben, and kind of, you know, once he has a handle on kind of Django in general, I'd feel comfortable kind of walking through that with Ben and showing him how we add an additional piece to the database, an additional field to the database, and then how do we actually kind of present that or change the configuration so that we can actually show that on the screen, right? So I think that's reasonable. I think that the second thing that we're looking at there is add the column for the AHEC scholars to the quick reports. Again, so the quick reports is kind of this major kind of sub chunk of the environment just now, and I think it would be reasonable to kind of walk through and have a look at, you know, where we would add that to the code and how we would do that, right? So I think that's a reasonable thing to do. The last part of this, creating a core topic box, I think is maybe the third thing that we would kind of look at, right? So it's the HCPP stuff is complicated, more so than the people page. So I think if we kind of got through the first two pieces of those and you know, nobody had resigned, then I think then the third piece is reasonable, but it would be the thing that I do third, right? Like it's the HCPP structured programs and event stations are kind of are more complicated by a factor of something than the first two pieces. But so I think kind of in terms of getting these done, then I think it would be reasonable if we want to work on those maybe in the first full week of May. So if Ben was at the point where he'd kind of gone through that Django process, had a look at the tutorials, felt comfortable with the general concepts in that time frame, then I think then we could kind of together have a look at what does it take to to do those first two pieces and then kind of just see from there whether or not that's going to be a good fit and we want to tackle the third piece together, or whether we want to whether I'll just add that third piece in that week and be done with that. So yeah, I think that's probably a reasonable plan going forward that we could kind of commit to actually doing.
Okay, that sounds good. And I think that after that, checking in and seeing how you feel, Benjamin, and how what your thoughts are, Brian, on how to move forward transition-wise, because I know that Connecticut and Utah have always similar concerns, and I want to make sure that we're thinking about next steps in terms of how we can make sure that the statewide collaborative, everybody's issues are getting attention. And I don't know.
Absolutely right.
So.
Yeah, absolutely right. We're certainly not functioning the way we want to be functioning just now, and I think in the kind of hit by a bus scenario, right? Like realistically, right now, we don't have resources right now to provide a kind of hot backup for me right now, right? So if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, it would be problematic for your daily business, right? So, which is not a great situation for any of us to be in, right? I would of course be hit by a bus, but that aside, right? You should be able to continue. I want you to be able to continue to function in that kind of scenario, right? And that's kind of a reasonable approach. So I think as we can kind of if we can work towards you supporting this in-house, then I think that's going to be kind of better for everybody. Even if it's just the initially supporting the kind of the day-to-day kind of changes that we have, these kinds of things that are listed here, then and supporting those in-house, then I think that's going to be better for everybody, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then in terms of like the hosting and all of those kind of annual things that are part of the contract, is that how it works? I don't even know, Lauren. Does that all go through Brian, or is that something that we do ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's through Brian.
So those are the other things like that we would want you to work with us on to make sure, right, to transfer all that over, and then we can go back to Connecticut and Utah, potentially whammy, and say, okay, here's what it's going to look like. We feel like in-house we can support this, and then everybody pays for a portion of Ben's time, or we have to hire somebody else on, or whatever it might look like. We want to pull as much away from you all so that we can handle that for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And the good news about that, right, is that cloud hosting has gone from this kind of complicated or, remote hosting, which we were doing 10 years ago, right? Like it wasn't really cloud hosting at that point. But hosting these kinds of platforms has gone from being a kind of complicated, you were really running and managing servers and doing lots of kind of, writing your own management tools and things like that, right? To something that is relatively low. It has a much lower barrier to entry now, right? You can, within a minute or two, essentially go deploy a server and kind of get it running and configured. So I think all of those things are reasonable as well, right? And we're certainly perfectly comfortable transitioning those hosts, or probably actually more specifically transitioning clones of those hosts to you guys so that you then are running in them and things are, DNS is pointing at your new host and we can deprovision ours, right? So yeah, totally on board with trying to get that transitioned off from our side to your side.
Perfect. Lauren, did you have other things?
Just that, so I have sent you, like in my last couple emails, I've attached the most up-to-date version of the contract where I included some comments. And a few other things have kind of come up in the last couple weeks that I would consider relatively high priority. So I would say, like, as far as, getting, we talked about the three things at the first page, so the multi-state changes, and then the second page is Alaska-specific things. The list of Alaska-specific things, if you're really at the point where you don't even know when you're going to get these things done, I would say this second page list is second tier. Yeah, and some of these other things that have come up that are not included in this list right now are more important. And so I might send you another kind of version of this.
Okay. So yes. Perfect. Okay, so let's do that, and I will. So that, let me just grab a calendar real quick, because I want to make sure before I say we can definitely do this. I want to make sure we can definitely do this. Okay. So that second week, so it's the first full week that is in May, right? So this is Monday the 7th through Friday the 11th. It does not look like things are particularly busy that week. So let's between now and then. Oh yeah, gosh, you guys are looking at my calendar. Did I get that right? Yeah, 7th through 11th. Okay, cool. So let's look at that week as being the we can walk through some things with Benjamin. We can, and then if you and I have kind of a prioritized list by then of like, this is what we have to get done, this is what we'd like to get done if we've got time, then we will just, we'll set aside some time that week to kind of focus on this and get a bunch of those topics knocked out. And some maybe with Benjamin, and some, you know, realistically will be not, because we will move faster in that case. But so we'll kind of look at that second week in the 7th through the 11th as being a time to get things knocked off this punch list and actually functional.
And then you could probably just schedule directly with Benjamin. You two can work together on what works best for the things that you do want to walk him through. And then we can work out whatever, you know, just not working on certain weeks just to get more of our hours done that week works fine. I know you're kind of
one day that week I've got, I think, a meeting with Dean or something like that. So
yeah, well, we can just work
I
through
can
it.
let you know
Okay.
when I get back to my office.
Perfect. Does that sound good, Brian?
I missed the last piece there from Benjamin. He's hard to hear on the mic, but
yeah, one day that week I know I've got, I think, an all-day meeting, but I can let you guys know by this afternoon what day that is.
yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, yeah. Brian, I'll have
so-
you the updated list of priorities by next week.
Okay, that's perfect. And then we can maybe just iterate on that a little bit so that I know exactly what we're looking at, and maybe, you know, kind of bounce back and forward ideas about, you know, so that we are very clear on what it will be that we're actually implementing, so that, you know, once we actually jump into the work, we can kind of roll forward as fast as possible.
Yep. And then in terms of Utah and Connecticut, I'm not really sure what they've submitted to you, but we probably should have a similar conversation about getting some of that stuff. I know that the main big things are across the board for everyone.
Right.
But I don't know what their priorities might be and how that all looks on them. Like, we're talking about us, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, Brian, have they submitted additional requests to you besides what's in this multi-state contract?
No, I don't think so. I think Connecticut just wants me to give them a bill, but I haven't done that because I haven't done any work. So,
Okay.
but other than that, I think
We'll let them know.
yeah.
Okay.
If they have things that they feel they want to get on that list, that's probably like this is a good window of opportunity to do that. So, yeah.
Perfect. That sounds good. Thank you.
All right. So, anything else? Do we have anything else this afternoon, or?
I'm just gonna double check my agenda. I don't think so.
Yeah, no, that's worthwhile.
All right, that was it. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. Talk to you later.
All right. See
Okay.
ya.
Bye bye.
Cheers.